Thank you for that introduction. And welcome to the new generation in China, many of whom we have here on the panel with us tonight, this morning. I'm going to just show a couple of visuals to kick this off that sort of take a frame shot about where we are today that gives you a bit of a longitudinal view. So if I can just queue up a few slides to start. So this is where the GDP is today in China, 12 trillion. And this, over the last 25 years, has grown from something in the 2 to 3 trillion area to 12 trillion today. And we're talking about the greatest revolution in growth, in economic growth, that we've ever seen in history. I think it's also interesting, as you think about China, to think about the rest of Asia and the dramatic growth we're seeing in ASEAN and India as well, that will benefit as China moves from being a manufacturer to a consumer. One of the things to observe and think about is this new population paradigm, and I think it will challenge a little bit the traditional views of demographics. So this is a snapshot in 1995 of the population tree. What you want is a nice fir tree like India had versus lumpy things in the middle. And if you fast forward to where we are in 2020, you can see China will start to face this major issue, which Mike Milken has addressed many, many times, about this rapidly aging Chinese population where the workforce is shrinking, with an enormous population reaching their senior years. And India maybe has the benefit here over the next couple of decades of having this very strong youth base moving into the workforce. This is the slide that, to me, is a bit of an aha moment, because if you sit in the US, all you hear about is trade deficits with China. But if you look at China overall, this is the year that it moves into a trade deficit overall. And that is fueling a lot of growth all over the world, particularly in Asia, as China shifts from being a manufacturer to a consumer. How the wealth effect is absolutely enormous and driving very, very radical change. One of the things that we've seen with the trade war is a very rapid shift in supply chains. This is Samsung's mobile phone manufacturing capacity. Everybody thinks all mobile phones come from China. As you can see, Samsung's producing 47% of their mobile device business in Vietnam, which I view as a major beneficiary. If you look at plans for moving high tech, and this is more in the semiconductor space, many companies are looking at second source or moving semiconductor manufacturing out of China, and it will benefit particularly the higher end manufacturing complexes in Japan, Korea, Taiwan. Technological leadership. This is patents in 1995. Many people have always asked the question about when can we expect patent protection? When can we expect Chinese to respect patents? Well, I think the answer will be when it's in their interest, and I think you can see today, patents today, they're leading the world in patent filings and innovation, and I think you'll see we're entering a world where it will be in the interest of Asian nations and the Chinese to have patent protection. So we'll see how that plays out. Been an enormous amount of dialogue recently on 5G and quite a lot of interpolitical debate. The reality is the United States is miles behind in 5G integration and development. And if you think about it, there really is no 5i alternative to 5G in the market today. This, to me, is the most dramatic slide. This is the financial, and this is a real element of financial inclusion as well. The blue dot is the mobile payment business in 2011. China, the US, relatively the same. If you look at the forecast for 2020, US is 283 billion. China's 47 trillion. So think of that in terms of transactions, think about it in terms of data, and think about what that means to the development of technology. And lastly, venture capital spending in AI. China is the leading in the world today, leading the world in AI investment today. So as we move to this new century in China and Asia, where will the benefits be in the rest of Asia? Where should we be investing? Where is the greatest innovation going to come from globally? And how is this landscape changing? So let me start with you. Jason, you've been a very active investor in technology in your prior life and with your new business, and we'll let you tell us what's most exciting in your life these days.
Yeah, so we've been a technology investor basically our entire career. I think for China, as you mentioned, there's a disposable income, dramatic disposable income increase in the population. So consumption-driven theses have been working out very well on the technology side. So e-commerce has gone through kind of the first evolution of merchandise, so products that are being sold online. Now we're seeing kind of the second wave of e-commerce where services are being ordered online and being fulfilled offline, right? So the likes of Didi, of Meituan of the world. And we're seeing verticals, large verticals being transformed by e-commerce as well, in healthcare, in logistics, in enterprise services. These are the large opportunities that we're seeing today.
So if this, how do you feel about this shift from this private sector technology development led by California in many ways in the US versus a much more monopolistic or oligopolistic development of technology in China? It was very different philosophies in terms of government and public and private sectors at work.
Yeah, well, I think so. First of all, I think there was a shift from kind of copy to China to copy from China in the past 10 years. If you look at the most prominent internet business models between Silicon Valley and China, maybe 10 years ago, there's usually a gap of 2, 3, 4 years where the search business, for example, portal business was started in the US and then it gets copied into China. These days, as you were showing just now, mobile payment, for example, in certain areas in biotech, in 5G, China is now leading the innovation and US is being kind of the follower in that extent. And I think that's a result of a variety of things. Certainly from a policy perspective, I think Chinese regulators are, at least from the technology sectors, one of the most pro-business set of regulations that we've seen compared to the US. There's very little antitrust limitations, so it allows giants like Alibaba and Tencent to deploy a lot of resources in different areas and build up infrastructure that works together. And then there's plenty of funding, right? So venture funding from, versus 10 years ago is about 50 to 60x. So there's entrepreneurship, there's plenty of engineering talent. So I think there's a variety of factors that's driving this whole huge wave of innovation in China tech.
Let's chat a little bit about the wealth effect, and Jin, I'll ask you to jump in a minute. I keep hearing that there's all these trillions here at Milken, and I think running that business for CICC, which is the most successful, largest domestic investment bank in China that has global footprint as well, you probably have most of those trillions under your purview. And then after that, Jonathan, come to you on where that wealth is going to get spent inside China. You want to take a crack at that, on how you see the development of this capital source and this wealth generation in China?
Maybe I will just have a broader view of what is changing in China. When we talk about new generation, investing in new generation of China, there are three things that come to my mind. One is there's a dramatic change in the mix of the economy. Right now, consumption is the main driver of the economic growth. And in nominal GDP terms, consumption is now growing 9–10%. Then investment is only growing by 4–5%. And this was just the opposite 5 years ago, when investment growth was twice as fast as consumption growth. So the country has been very successful in transforming the economic growth model from investment-led to consumption-led. So that's first thing. The second is who is really benefiting this change. And if you talk about investing in China, normally you talk about those dominant players in traditional industries. But now you are looking at a different type of animals, which is the tech industry of China. And this industry is very different from all the established competitors in China, state-owned enterprises, and even the private enterprises that in the traditional industries, the real estate and the manufacturing. And I can even go as far as saying these tech companies are very different from like Korean tech companies, Samsung, SG, even Japanese tech companies, because the new generation of tech companies in China, they have been very, very little financed by the financial sectors in China, particularly the banking sector. And these companies are getting their seed fundings from companies like SoftBank from Japan, from IDG from China. And they have a very little relationship to the established mainstream of China structure. So we're talking about really very silicon type of industries. They work very, very hard, and they are very independent. And nobody is too big to fail. So traditionally, when you talk about investing in China, you look at those dominant players in the traditional sectors. But now you really have to pay closer attention to the new generation of China tech sectors, which are bringing new changes to those traditional sectors. And some of the changes are very, very disruptive. And the third thing that comes to my mind is the policy shift. And for the last 30 years, the policy is really driven by Deng Xiaoping's idea, which is really best represented by his quote. It doesn't matter if the cat's color is black or white, as long as the cat can catch its mouse. But now it's different. By Xi's quote, the leader of current administration, the quote is, we are not going to leave anyone behind on our road to prosperity. So the focus here is really structural changes to really rebalance the economy. So as we speak, China is really launching wars in terms of those structural reforms. And we are talking about environmental protection and corruption, anti-corruption, and some of the financial sector changes. And every single restructural reforms in those sectors, they are just like wars. You have to really fight against the existing interests, and somehow you have to a lot of labor issues, social stability issues. So the focus is really how do you still maintain growth while you are fighting those structural issues.
So Jonathan, you published a very interesting report from McKinsey that focused on luxury in China. And often people think about technology, they think about all kinds of different businesses in China, but this luxury drive is quite powerful, and I thought there's some very interesting aspects of that piece that you might want to share and talk about. How big is this wave?
Sure, Tim, and thanks. And first of all, I wanted to follow up on the previous speaker said. I absolutely agree with that. I mean, I think that there is, because everything else I'm going to say is not about that, but this shift towards recognizing the growing sort of differences in China between rich and poor, and between urban and rural, and between coastal and inland, and how do we bring it all together? But let's talk about the one end of that, which is the rich, urban, coastal, younger people in China, which kind of defines the growth market for global luxury goods. So 2/3 of global luxury consumption will be coming out of China. It's a market that we think is about 770 billion RMB today, will go to about 1.2 trillion over the next 5 to 7 years. And it's not a big number of people actually talking about this. So this is a wedge. I mean, so it's actually more like about 25 million people who are doing this in China. Most of them have been born sometime in the 80s, and so they're relatively younger people. They are, and a lot of them just started buying stuff like last year. I mean, so the 90s generation is just off the ground here. As a result, they're new. They are consistent over the years in their inconsistency, that they will switch brands. They are looking to follow, iconic products around, and they don't know that much. Most of them don't actually know where the brands are coming from, particularly North American brands, I might mention, that a lot of famous Canadian products they think come from Europe or elsewhere. So that can work out sometimes favorably. But a few more names: Minnie Yang, Angela Baby, Go-Go Boy, my personal favorite. Anybody? I don't know if anybody knows these guys and girls, because each of them has over 100 million followers. And so if you want to sell luxury goods in China, that's who you are talking to.
I thought you were talking about the Kardashians.
Oh,
Anyway,
no, they should come. They should come. Everybody's welcome. But that's kind of a snapshot, I think. And it's just it's a social media driven market, so it's quite fast moving and changes all the time. And that is a big deal for any consumer retail luxury, particularly high-end company. Is that's who you have to go after, not just in China but globally. I mean, because they are the global growth market. That's it.
And Chinese brands will also capture that space.
Chinese brands are growing. It takes a lot of work to build a brand, and I think the consistency of quality and the capacity to build that iconic image. I mean, I think that's the hard work that Chinese companies have to do.
And even you have an interesting seat as running Temasik's business and in China, and the range of investment activities that your organization has and the reach into a lot of different sectors is quite unique. And so as you sort of look at the landscape of what you're participating in China, I think it'd be interesting to share where you see most opportunity in the most interesting space.
Thanks, Tim. We're investing essentially into that shift you just shown. The economy is really fast changing to a service-led and consumption-led economy. And the way we summarize the opportunity is we're investing into a better world, a smarter world, and more connected world. A better world is associated with longer lifespan, for example, healthcare, rising needs of wealth management. The second aspect of the better world is the younger generation more into sustainability, for example. And then the last aspect of the better world is really the rising middle class, and then the consumption that's coming out of it. And particularly, as Jonathan has mentioned, the millennials, we would call it in Chinese called the 95后, born after 95. Those people born after 95 has very particular characteristic, is they are not concerned about their financial future, because every single one of them has 4 houses or apartments above them waiting for being inherited, right? Because they are single children, they have both parents, and then each of them have 2 apartments. And most of the Chinese individual wealth, same as US, is tied into real estate. So these children are born into financial security. They consume in a totally different way than people born before 80s. They literally consume like Americans, right? They borrow to consume, and they consume other than just financial goods and luxury, they are into experience. So the stereotypical of the last generation of the Chinese tourists, for example, has totally changed. When you look at the people born in 95, they're not going to a monument to take a snap, and they're really going to, for example, go to Japan and then to experience the stories in the anime. So these are type of behaviors fundamentally shifting. The second, the smarter world, obviously, we can talk about AI, we can talk about automation. And one of the themes we have been investing and benefiting tremendously from it is digital transformation of everything. The digital transformation of traditional industries, particularly pronounced in China, because for 3 reasons, right? One is these trends that fundamentally transform the world, China is catching up or at the same frontier as the US. And then second is, in generally, China has the largest population or the consumption of such digital, for example, market. And lastly, the traditional industry is very not established, right? So it's very easy to be disrupted. So that's why in any disruption of traditional industry, for example, e-commerce disrupting traditional commerce, or Tencent disrupting the entire, I would call it TV industry, right? Because the younger generation watches everything on video, and then now it's going to long video to short video, and then all kinds of innovation come up. And then lastly, we call it more connected world. Obviously, we can talk about IoT, we can talk about the shared economy. One thing I want to highlight is because of all the innovation, now we see innovation come from the intersection of the industries, right? So for example, digital industry and financial industry. So you have the whole, we talked about the whole, we call it fintech, that in China is actually come in different forms. How do you use technology in insurance? How do you use technology in wealth management, et cetera? And also you have the digital and healthcare. And the largest market, what we see in application of AI and data is actually in health industry, and China is actually running very fast into it. So that, in a nutshell, is how we look at the market.
Goodwin, you're in a unusual seat in that you've invested over the history of your institution actively both in the U.S. and China as two main markets, but also now in some of the other ASEAN markets, Vietnam, and you've been both a real asset investor in real estate as well as technology around the edges. Maybe just as this shift in China that we discussed has been developing, where do you see the opportunities changing? And also maybe as opposed to the massive multiples of revenues and projected revenues and fictional revenues, how are real assets being valued today in the market, in real estate? So maybe that's two questions in there for you.
Okay. So a couple of things. Obviously, I think we pay a lot of attention to the shift in lifestyle, right? The mobile payment, I think it's a very good number, 47 trillion versus 283 billion in the US. So the whole mobile payment, the Chinese young consumer being highly adaptable to early adopter to technology because of mobile devices in their pocket, and partly because they never worry about data privacy, because essentially they're used to being monitored. So they feel if they're given the data privacy, they're going to have a better experience, a better product offered to them because they are being tracked. So because of that, these early adopters actually, the lifestyle is changing quite rapidly in China. And that change in lifestyle is actually allowing someone like us to offer real estate as a different kind of product. They're consuming real estate even differently. So take, for example, housing. The housing in China is essentially a saving mechanism, right? Historically, Chinese people always like to put their excess capital into real estate because they believe in bricks more than they believe in putting money in the bank. And so then you're going to say that means there should be a pretty interesting market as younger generation move into the city on rental housing. Yes and no. Where rental housing, you don't own. So you're giving money away when you pay rent. So one of the sectors we're quite focused on is what we call co-living, which is essentially, I think, China's model of rental housing. Because if you have a family in China, you are expected to own a place, own a home, either given from your parents on two sides, and then you move up. Because, in fact, they have a term called naked marriage in China. So if let's say you have a daughter. Your daughter is getting married to a guy. If the guy doesn't actually own a home before he proposed to your daughter, that's marrying into a naked marriage, a bit of an embarrassment for the female side. Right? So when...
It's like a dowry.
Exactly. Household formation has a lot to do with real estate ownership. So because of that, if you believe in that, then you're going to say, okay, so if people start a family, they're going to want to buy their own flat. However, there's a lot of job being produced by all the big tech companies and the big financial companies in tier 1 cities in particular, Shanghai, Beijing, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, and Hangzhou coming up. And these cities are attracting a lot of young graduates. The young graduates are used to living in dormitory. So when they move to these new cities, they don't know anyone. They're moving away from home, and they want to hang out with other young people. So the co-living model will likely be the rental model that will actually generate a lot of demand from this younger generation. They're essentially moving from a dormitory model in colleges to an adult dormitory where a lot of communal services overlay like a hotel, essentially. And those communal services will allow them to meet younger people. And it's very tech-savvy. All of these co-living models, there can be asset-heavy co-living or asset-light co-living, but a lot of it all has to do with an app, very easy for them to find an apartment, very easy for them to meet friends within their community. It's building community. That's the difference, right? So that's one aspect that I think is going to be quite interesting, and it's going to be a very big sector that will play out. In terms of outside Asia, as China moved from a manufacturing country to a consumer country, wages are going up, right? We talked about earlier how
$10,000 per worker in
Median
China versus, something in the 20% level of
Correct.
that in other markets.
And in particular, you see the ready-made garment sector, which has always been dominated in southern Guangzhou, which is the Guangzhou region, South China, Guangzhou, which is next to Shenzhen. And actually, it's an interesting play, right? To give you an idea on how China thinks forward, they know they're losing the manufacturing hub, at least on the ready-made garment side, because of rising labor wages, which is pushed by the central government. They know next to Guangzhou is Shenzhen, which is the software tech hub of Huawei and Tencent. And they know Hong Kong has finance and managerial skill. So they have built the high-speed trains for you now in Hong Kong to be 17 minutes into Shenzhen.
And one border, no two borders.
Right, one border. The bridge across to Macau and Zhuhai. Now you
Longest
can
bridge
drive
in the
across.
world.
Right, the infrastructure is there. To now they launch Greater Bay Area to say, for us to challenge Silicon Valley, we need the manufacturing hub for the robotics advance. We need the tech hub for AI advance. But we still need management, finance skill sets to raise money, and that's Hong Kong. So this is pretty interesting. But go back to the $10,000 rising wages questions. Where are they all going? In fact, most of the manufacturers in China, that was the engine where they were getting a lot of foreign currency owning medium-sized factories. Those money were all channeling to buying real estate in China. A lot of those factories are now being shuttered in southern China, going to Vietnam. Because Vietnam built infrastructure first, highly productive workforce, very, very young. 72% of the population is under the age of 35. Right? That's 90 million people plus. Highly productive, extremely high work ethics, productivity. So that's where you're seeing a lot of growth. As a result, we actually, it's interesting, I'll give a little real-life example. We have a fairly large residential project in the middle of Ho Chi Minh City, which is essentially the Shanghai of Vietnam. The same 6 phases of housing projects. 2016 was the first phase, 570 units. It took 9 months to sell out at about $220 square foot. 2017 was the second phase, 3 months to sell out, same size at $330 square foot. The last phase was about 9 months ago. It took 2 months to sell out at $400 square foot. And this is driven by a lot of those manufacturers with those factories earning US dollars, repatriating the money or earning hard currency and putting the savings in real estate.
What would that apartment cost in Shanghai per square foot?
The $400 is fairly high end, so that equivalent would be about $1,200 to $1,200 square foot equivalent.
Is the U.S. still interesting to you?
West Coast, yes. Right, it's still the innovation capital of the world. And
We got that going for us.
And U.S. you can always pick. You can pick the cities you want to avoid and pick the cities that you want to focus on.
Just want to go back to the payments world because it's quite unique, and financial, which some of you have invested in. It might be worth sharing some of the statistics about how rapidly they can process financial loans, transactions. I don't know who has it, you or?
Yeah, we're discussing that. I heard it from both. In fact, this is the same number.
The finance arm of Alibaba called Ant Financial, which did a private round, I think at a valuation of around 150 billion.
That's right.
So maybe the largest private company financing ever.
It is.
256,000 transactions per second versus So this is the processing power of both Alipay and actually WeChat Pay. Both of them are up to that standard now. Whereas Visa, MasterCard is 56,000.
And they can process a loan in 3 seconds, I think.
In 3 seconds, and from if you actually take a step back and look at the infrastructure in China, look at what U.S. have, you have different credit agencies, you have individual consumer credit scores. In China, that is a vacuum when Ant Financial started. Right. Within about 10 years, they essentially created the credit system for about kind of 800 million people. Plug that into e-commerce, and now they're lending to about 48 million merchants who are doing business on Ant Financial and getting loans on Ant Financial. So it's not just, I think it's, if not the first, it's one of the first true online banks in the world. And mobile payment is just one side of the business, but it's a full-on multi-function financial institution that's never seen before. And it's totally using artificial intelligence to grant loans. It's using AI to price discriminate.
So no credit bureaus. It's all based on, historic payment relationships that comes through.
Yep. Yeah. So
and so far, low default rate as well, like
yes,
0.01
that's right.
or something like that.
And if you look at, they launched Yuobao, which is the essentially a deposit account. And it became, in I think 3 months, became the largest money market product in the world. It became 2.3 trillion RMB in less than 100 days. So from just a scale and how they were running that in an autonomous fashion, from that perspective, I think they're definitely leading the world.
So, Jin, I don't know if you want to take this or not, but if that's true, and deposits and loans are being pulled out of bricks and mortar, the large banks, the ICBs, the ICBCs, the BComs, what happens to the bricks and mortar institutions when they lose all that margin against a very high cost of running all those facilities and assets around the country? I mean, and maybe this is the same in every market. Are we going to be seeing more of a crisis in the traditional banking world?
I think this is a reality those traditional financial institutions are facing. So they are under tremendous pressure to transfer their business model from traditional lending, taking deposit, to now wealth management. And China just announced a very important policy 2 years ago that all the existing financial products sold by those domestic institutions, which have a lot of implicit government guarantees, have to be withdrawn. So all the financial institutions, including private banks and the commercial banks, they have to be selling the products on the basis of the true valuation of individual product. So there's a lot of financial reforms going on in China, and also the reality that people are stay away from traditional way of financing and go direct to the capital market for fundraising at a lower cost. So this sea of change is really forcing traditional financial institutions to upgrade their digital capability and also increase their capability of servicing the wealth management demand of institutions and the individuals. So this is really the big thing. If you look at the financial report of those listed banks, you can see the traditional business is shrinking and it's growing at zero growth rate, but the wealth management part is growing at 20%, 30%, 40%.
I want to ask a different question because I think you have a unique perspective. And personally, I've been dead wrong on the convertibility of the RMB. I would have thought in my time in Asia that by now we would have seen a more convertible currency. We have an economy, the two largest economies in the world, the US and China. One has a totally open currency, totally open model, and the other is highly restricted still. And with all that savings, all that wealth, all the good things we've talked about, and a nation that trades as much as China, isn't it time that we had a currency that was more flexible?
Yeah, that's there's no question that everybody can agree with that final destination, which is a full convertibility of RMB. And I think China has been making tremendous efforts achieving that objective. But the reality of the country is that we are not ready. We don't have a very deep capital markets, the stock market, the bond market. So imagine if everybody can buy China shares one day and leave China shares tomorrow out of country. There's no way the market can cope. And also financial institutions are not ready. They don't have sophisticated risk controls. So if you are going to encounter the big fluctuation of the markets, then how those institutions can survive? And even though
we'll be ready in
well, I think the
sometime this decade. Or?
Yeah, the priority of the priority of the policy is that now China is making tremendous efforts to get ready. So they are making efforts to establish domestic professional institutions, so they can trade on a very rational basis, and also they are. It's opening up, but in only one direction. China is very, very open for money coming into China through Shenzhen Direct, Shanghai Direct. But now the restriction for money going out of the country is still very, very restricted.
So
I think this is a pretty prudent way of achieving that goal. If on one hand, I think the government realized that it's an embarrassment for economy as large as China, and still the convertibility is slower than other much poorer countries like other countries like Brazil, less developed Brazil or India. But on the other hand, they realize that stability is the number dominant priority in China. No government can lose.
So I think it's I think this is an issue that as investors we should all, and citizens, you should all watch very closely, because it will be a earthquake event when it happens, and it will have massive implications on currency, not just the RMB, but the U.S. dollar, seniorage, and it'll be very interesting to watch that development. But yeah,
one quick
please.
comment.
Yeah.
If you pull up internet, try to look at a picture, search for a picture of the 5 Chinese leaders, the senior leadership, standing there versus President Trump. On one side is actually the Chinese leaders are managers. They're bureaucrats, right? It's a pyramid system. They take a small region, a city, a region, a district, a state, and they move up to the very, very top. So they're managers by nature.
So they have competence.
They love control. They love control, right? So the currency situation goes back to the fundamental about them afraid of losing control, because they're managers.
So
versus politicians or TV stars.
So there's a lot of good things. I just maybe just on to my left. What are the there's a lot of positive, obviously. I mean, we've talked about a lot of the issues that are going to drive this massive economy and this massive transition. What are some of the challenges, Yibing, Jonathan, on that when you see real concern, issues like the environment, and how is this going to play out?
I just want first to come back to your question on the financial innovation.
Yeah.
And it's a good illustration. At one point, I'm impressed on how regulators in China, on the one hand, foster innovation, on the other hand, not taking their eye off the ball of financial discipline, for example. Mm-hmm. One of the questions that you ask is, say, hey, what does that do? What does all the financial innovation do to the traditional financial industry? What we've observed is, you guys invested into it. The traditional financial banks are actually catching up very fast into the whole digital world, right? So you guys invested into Du Xiaoman, and the flip side of that was Baixin Yinhang. That's the CITIC Bank. and their digital bank. It's the first digital bank coming into it with the full license, and they work very closely with Du Xiaoman. And then ICBC and CCB in answering to Ant, and been literally starting from 2 years ago and making a major push into the digital bank. Historically, the reason that they've been not so avant-garde in terms of making small loans is really because of the regulation. And in China, out of the heritage of 2004, the banking regulation, they have 2 hard rules on banks. One is called bad loan goes with you for your life, right? If you're a loan officer, if you made a bad loan, it doesn't matter where you will be in the future, 20 years down the road, it's on your account.
So we just leave it to the computers now. They don't have to worry.
So right, if you become PBOC chairman, and it's on your thing, and so they have very little motivation for them to lend to SMB. And then for this year, they start to change the rules of, before they regulated on both absolute amount of the bad loans that's tolerated, as well as the bad loan ratio for a loan officer. It's called 双降. You have to reduce both the relative and absolute loan amount. Now this year they made a hard quota and saying to foster SMB lending, a bank needs to lend at least 35% to SMB. They have the reverse quota now, right? So they encourage the lending officers to lend to SMB. So and hence, if you will, the traditional industries had a license to do the SMB lending now. So they're making a major push into it. On the other hand, the regulators in China is actually walking the line very carefully. On the one hand, allowing the innovators to run fast. On the other hand, doing anti-monopoly or antitrust. The traditional antitrust rule in digital world does not really work, right? That's a global issue. In the payment, for example, what the regulators, PBOC, clearly said, they've seen Ant Finance running away, they've seen Tencent running away. They say, I don't want 2 private networks essentially monopolize the entire online payment infrastructure. What they've done is create Nets Union. So they make everyone who's going to make and duplicate infrastructure, everyone owns a part of a master infrastructure and clearance network, right? So, and Financial and Tencent become the shareholder of that, and is run by PBOC. And that network over the last 2 years, and has gradually have shifted away from an individual company's influence and then become essentially infrastructure of its own. So China probably has now the best digital infrastructure for online payment, and that's shared by everyone. That has very significant in anti-monopoly, because if you're a small company, you don't have the money to build the large infrastructure. Now you can ride that bus and then ride on your innovation. So I think that's very impressive. So the challenge, it comes always in China, come from how you walk that line, between the, as you mentioned in the very beginning, the state influence versus the private innovation. What we've been very encouraged is this round of innovation is, in the last 10 years, is driven really by private industry, right? So the state effort of funding innovation actually did not work, right? Semiconductor is the classic example. In China for the last 20 years, I'm pumping so much money into state companies trying to do semiconductors. They didn't go anywhere, right? But rather in this whole digital economy, and they said, let me set a regulatory framework to foster or to be more tolerant to the private innovation, and that worked. So I think it's really the state, how they would play their supervisory role versus fostering innovation. I think that's the, I think it's the fine line they're walking. That lies the opportunity and the challenge.
So, Jonathan, maybe you can help on this a bit. We talked a little bit at the start about the demographic challenges that China's facing. So, you had India on one side. And by the way, I would encourage you to look at the acceleration in technology in India. And it's at that inflection point that maybe China was 5 to 7, 8 years ago, because of really driven by the amount of Wi-Fi and high-speed data communication that's being broadly disseminated now. And if you look at many websites and many downloads, the Indian market is bigger than China and the US combined. So I would keep your eye on that, and it's a massive change. But if you take India, which has, I think, million 18-year-olds every month entering the workforce, which is a massive challenge. It's kind of a youth bulge. And then China, where you have so many people, the society will age faster than any society ever in history, where Japan is the oldest society that living today. It's also a massive challenge, and the reason the savings rate is so high is that people are largely self-insured. They don't have the support. But managing that kind of an aging population requires rapid pension reform, rapid acceleration in the healthcare industries, and it's an opportunity and a challenge, Jonathan. I know it's not the luxury goods sector, but it's arguably more important than in terms of the development of China. But how do you see that? And then we can talk about some of the innovations we're seeing in healthcare, because without HIPAA rules, the acceleration of technology is going to be quite dramatic in that area. Maybe you want to.
Yeah, well,
and that whole, you think about robotics. Robotics is a disaster for India if you're trying to generate that much workflow. But if you're China with a shrinking workforce, being the world leader in robotics may be a good place to be.
sure, and of course people feel very strongly about their handbags, so I won't go there. Yeah. But I do think that, you got a bunch of points in there. I also want to come back to the barriers and challenges and risks. So first of all, on AI, and if Kai-Fu is here, I'm sure he would say, China loves AI. AI is great for China. There aren't going to be any more new Chinese, and so the workforce has peaked. So if China's going to get rich, China has to get smart. And so each and every Chinese worker has to become that much more productive if they're actually going to have a prosperous middle-class economy. So dark factories, right? Go for that, and continue the productivity revolution in industry and extend it to services, because that's the big prize. Is sort of how does one bring China's labor productivity and services from where it is roughly 15 to 20% of OECD averages up to something more close to 50 to 100%. So and anybody who's been in a Chinese service business knows this. Spend any time in a Chinese hotel, and a Chinese security firm, and a Chinese travel agency, you can see a lot of people doing not very much. And of course, that is why online works, is because offline is so genuinely horrible. So that the AI sort of revolution is a lot about just delivering on all of that promise to an enfranchised consumer. So I think that healthcare is a classic, example of that. And so the healthcare in China is built around tertiary hospitals in major cities. You go to any one of them, you'll see a parking lot, quite literally, of people sitting in, chairs with IV drips, attached to them. That's no way to run a railroad, let alone a hospital. And so how does one actually turn that into a service where people can, first of all, have more information, secondly, have more service, and as a result, hopefully improve the health effects on an economy which is fast becoming a OECD, obesity, NCD sort of driven healthcare economy. So those are the problems China faces now. It's no longer public health. It's all about how do you take care of yourself. And so that's where AI can help. But then, and I will just close by saying, on the barriers and the risks. I think we've spent a lot of time on the public-private, and I think that's absolutely fair. But I think it sort of, when people talk about the state's return in China, I wonder what they're talking about, because I don't see it in the private sector. I just think that we have very clearly passed the point where the public sector has any real material influence on the economy. It is a policy, certainly, yes, but every government has policy influence. But state enterprises, no, it's basically not relevant. So it's is about how does one transform these private companies.
That's counterintuitive, actually. Yeah. That's counter to what.
It's certainly counter the narrative, but I tell you, anyone who's trying to, I'm sure which sector. There are the challenge is essentially to continue that process, because, and particularly in services where you may not have state enterprises, but you have local oligopolistic behavior. You have companies which are private nominally, but are in control of the licenses, of the access to the hospital, or the access to the warehouse, to the port, or whatever. And those kind of things need to get solved. So I think that's the big challenge for China, is to continue to break those barriers and to support the globalization and competitiveness of the Chinese economy, particularly in services.
So we're going to see definitely changing models in healthcare delivery, that just like in the fintech sector with Ali Tencent is going to be completely different. So on the delivery of healthcare in China, what kind of models are we seeing out there? I know, Goodwin, you've spent some time in that as well, that have real estate angles, but also technology driven, because there's just not going to be enough physical doctors in the country to handle.
Right, so it's really, again, it's really driven by being online and offline on the two sides, right? So we started a venture with Tencent actually a couple of years ago to figure out what is the new generation of, how would a new generation of clinics look like? And actually the whole idea is the whole idea started with how do we create more income for the doctors? Right now the license is actually held in the hospitals. So the doctors historically have not been allowed to practice privately, so they can't earn extra income. So historically they earn extra income by prescribing medicine or sending you to surgery. That's where they get commissions, or that's where they get commissions from the drug companies. So the new generation was thinking, how do we create these clinics where essentially the doctors can co-work, right? That's essentially how the idea started. And then it morphed into where some of the companies within the Tencent world are actually in the virtual world of connecting all these doctors, information network. So then the doctors are rated among doctors for what they're specialists in and all that. As it evolved, it becomes online and offline, so that if you're a member, different level of memberships, if you're a member, you actually will get, you wear these different sensors in the body. So instead of you reading what the sensor is telling you, your WeChat app is basically reading through the cloud how your vital signs are. Already. So basically your heart rate, your hydration level, your sleep pattern will be diagnosed by machines and then pushed to you saying you're not sleeping enough, you're drinking too much, you're partying too hard. All of that.
Is that on your WeChat?
It is.
No, okay.
It is.
You're being tracked.
It is. And then essentially, then it'll ping you a message saying, why don't you call the call center, which you talk to a senior nurse to talk about maybe you need to come in. And they say, if you need to come in, then a doctor appointment will be made. And then different level of services will basically essentially be like private banking model. If you're in the high tier level, you'll be assigned a private consultant where they will look after 5 to 10 families. All your healthcare needs to, when you see a doctor, which specialist do you see, the appointments will be booked for you, if you need to be sent overseas to do surgery, all of it is taken care of. That's how it's being rethought. And quite a few people are doing this.
Jason, before we go to you, I'm going to just warn all the panelists that we have about 7 minutes left. I'm going to ask you all in a minute the most interesting idea, company, trend, opportunity, or challenge. You can pick whatever you want. We'll do a little speed dating towards the end here, but just on the healthcare side.
Yeah, so
what are
on the
you seeing
healthcare
in
side,
delivery?
we're much more focused on the more asset-light businesses. So there are two areas that we think are being transformed. One is on the distribution of healthcare products, both on the pharmaceutical side and medical devices. Before, it's a very opaque industries, and I think the regulators are trying very hard to bring kind of the e-commerce and transparency into that. So there's a series of reforms on license being given out and what products and how they can be distributed online. Those are obviously large opportunities where, instead of 3 or 4 layers in between, now you have an opportunity to be kind of the disintermediate a lot of the brokers out there. Mm-hmm. And I think that's going to help with the cost on both pharmaceutical and medical products, medical devices. And I think it's going to be ultimately a lower cost for both the government and the consumers. So that's one side of the equation. The other side we're looking for is more data-driven, kind of artificial intelligence-enabled, personalized healthcare service providers. So that's coming primarily from the private sectors, often led by the likes of Tencent, of Alibaba of the world, where in China, you have a different regulatory environment where privacy concerns is much less in China than here. You could even argue people value their lives a little bit less than here, so they're more willing to try more experimental things. And there's a whole concept of moving towards more personalized medication and preventative care. And China is trying to do that from a kind of from scratch. It's trying to leapfrog the US where they're trying to combine different things together. So for example, if you combine...
It's a 90% generics business right now.
Yeah.
Right, market 90%.
Right.
And it's interesting that the China FDA is going through a process where they're evaluating every molecule, and I think there'll be 2 or 3 that after they go through that evaluation will be the market.
The way the biotech industry in China is evolving is they're trying to bring all different pieces together. So before, if you're a genomics company, you focus on that. If you're a pharmaceutical company, you focus on that. Now, there are companies in China that are trying to bring different disciplines together. What that's creating is, and in a different regulatory environment. That's why we're seeing a lot of CFIUS backlash on, there's a more popular case of iCarbonX, which is an artificial intelligence-based business biotech company in China, buying US assets and trying to put different pieces together that was previously approved by CFIUS is now that approval was overturned. I think where you see protectionism is where the innovation between China and the US is becoming the closest. You see that in 5G and telecommunications as well. I think that's another big area in healthcare that we're seeing, kind of a artificial intelligence-based, information-based health management system for them.
But Tim, as you pointed out, I think the CFDA reform of the last 3 years, what we've seen really is the classic example of how a fast regulatory change has fostered entire new industry, right? So CFDA's reform, in short, basically is be like FDA, right? They literally did that. So if you're a multinational, you bring a drug to China, the speed of lagging, instead of 10 years now, you're coming into the latest PD-1, for example, is about a year and a half. And then that, in return, benefited every player, right? So you got the likes of Innovent Beijing. They bring their PD-1 into the market at half the price or a quarter of price. They are innovative molecules, and then so much so that US FDA is saying, I welcome these guys, to sell the molecules in the US because they can bring down the healthcare costs. So really, they fostered a whole set of innovation.
So we have about 3 minutes left, so I'll go to this little idea forum. And we'll start with you, Goodwin. The idea, the company, the asset, the place that's most interesting, or where you're most concerned. You just get one pick.
I like co-living, which is essentially the rental model in China. Not a demand.
And is there a company in particular?
I don't want to advertise our own company.
Okay.
I think the biggest opportunity, one of the biggest opportunities is really there's a huge accumulation of wealth. But the challenge is how to channel the wealth into the investments that are greatly needed by the China economy going forward.
So
we need a lot of VCPs, but by nature of risk averse, those assets are currently held mostly by individuals. These individuals mainly put their money in real estate, commercial banks for fixed income, very little appetite for risk. So if somebody can have a way of changing that reality, I think that would be a great opportunity.
Yeah. Yibing?
We think the most interesting opportunity is connecting worlds, essentially investing into that interface between different industries, as I mentioned, digital and healthcare, and digital and financial, and building platforms instead of being minority investors for us, because 26% of our asset is in China. So we have to build platforms.
Jonathan?
Sustainability. I think China only has one China. So, and they are going to be the leading force in sustainability investment, broadly defined, not only carbon, but air and water, and the technologies associated with that.
Mm-hmm. Services being brought online, both consumer and enterprise services. So longer value chain, more traditional services are being disrupted by online solutions.
My pick is going to be China outbound tourism. And the wealth effect and the scale, because it's the highest end of the market. It's massive. They're the largest per capita spenders as tourists. So I think cruising, hotels offshore, education tourism, and specifically medical tourism, very good point, and specifically real estate and restaurants in Hokkaido. I want to thank you all for your attention.
100% agree.
I want to thank you all for your attention today, and thank you for joining us.